gem.
You know, ever since we've been going on digital adventures, there's been one thing that's the focal point, whether we've been a sword-wielding laser master or some sort of wizard casting spells, and that is the dungeons. Let's ask ourselves, what is a dungeon for? Why are we so excited about them in our fantasy games? Stories and narrative are a huge factor. Look at the dead mines in World of Warcraft, uncovering the secrets of Edwin Van Cleef and his Defias, or the vaults in FF14, encroaching on the Heavens Ward and... no spoilers. Now that's a balance. Too much roleplaying and players get frustrated on repeat playthroughs. Look at the pain caused by Trial of the Crusader in Wrath of the Lich King. Because apparently, the devs thought, at the time, standing around for 2.5 minutes doing absolutely nothing every time you went into the dungeon was really engaging gameplay. Not just the story though. It's about the loot. Dungeons contain those big, shiny items. They give you massive experience, huge quest turn-ins. So needless to say, dungeons are a very big deal, and players want them. But game dungeons have come a long way over the years, and it turns out that the people who made the original dungeons in MMOs didn't really know what to make in the first place. So today, my friends, we are going on an adventure to the past. We're going to look at where the MMO dungeons came from, where they're ultimately going, and what makes the perfect MMO dungeon. Alright, first things first. How big should a dungeon be? How long should it take in an MMO? Those of you who've played like the original World of Warcraft or Classic will realize and probably notice that the first dungeons that came with the game were very different than what came after, and that's including before the Burning Crusade. You see, the people who made World of Warcraft had to design the dungeons on what they knew and what they thought was cool. And in order to find out what that was, we're gonna have to go back to the 1990s. You see, in the first MMOs like EverQuest back in '99 by Daybreak, they had to design their dungeons based on what they knew, but they didn't have much in the virtual world to draw on. What they did have though were board games. Take what you see in your head during those massive sessions of D&D and then make that in the virtual world. For example, the first dungeons weren't even instanced. 5 years ago, John Statz wrote a book called The WoW Diary. And who's he, might you ask? Well, he's the guy who built many of the areas that you guys love in World of Warcraft. Outdoor areas, raids, dungeons, including the infamous and everyone's favorite, Wailing Caverns. In the book, he explains that he spent so long building Wailing Caverns, based only on the information, right? That it would be a cave with dinosaurs in it. Go wild. So he spends all his time building it. Then he goes to his boss, Jeff Kaplan, and he says, here you go, here's Wailing Caverns, to which Jeff says, cool, now you can start building the dungeon. It turns out he'd just been making the waiting area, and the instance portal originally was supposed to be the front of the cave, but now it was going to be at the back of the cave. So John goes back to his PC, right, and starts making more and more dungeon. And every time he turns his work in, his boss Jeff Kaplan tells him to go bigger. The exact words were, and I quote, "There is no such thing as a dungeon that's too big. When in doubt, make it bigger." So he ends up adding more and more. Just look at these screenshots of the iterations of what he did. And then in a Reddit AMA, he points out that Wailing Caverns actually had way more stuff that eventually got cut, including mazes and all sorts of stuff. Recently, I played WoW Hardcore, had the absolute best time, and died.
It's over.
But during that run, I got to do Wailing Caverns again. Now, I've done Wailing Caverns probably 50 to 60 times over my course of playing WoW, and I still get lost in there. Jeff, no, dungeons can be too big. So my team did some digging and went back over all the dungeons that have existed in MMOs for a long time. On average, back in like the early 2000s, it would take something like 40 minutes to an hour to do a dungeon on average. And the theory that we found after doing some research was that players would intentionally be taking breaks during these dungeons. That was the design idea. And then they would come back later to finish up, or it was intended that they just wouldn't finish the dungeon every time they went to do it. Why do you think that Alderman has 2 entrances? That's why. They expect you to go in, spend a good portion of your day in there, come out, go for lunch, then come back and regroup later and finish it up, or just stop halfway. Not just WoW either, right? Let's look at other games. Guild Wars 2 had a lot of the same devs that worked on early WoW go over there to make it, and they did the same again. That's what they knew. Big, sprawling 40-minute dungeons, but they had a new idea to go with it, right? Every dungeon would have multiple pathways through it. Let me give you this map of the Ascalonian Catacombs. As you can see, you just go left, you go right, you go down, then you go up, and then you come around, and then you circle up and you go there, and that's one run. But then you can go right, you can turn around, and then you can come back up through the pathway, and then you can go up there, and then you get a second run out of it. But if you want to do another one, you can do that too. You can come back round and go up there, and then you can circle back round to yourself, but cross over the path of the first one. Of course you're going to do that. And then you finish up on the third dungeon. You got lost? I gave you a map. But of course, as with all things, time changes, and they started to get player feedback. And shockingly, it turned out, and you won't believe this, you won't, players didn't like spending 3 or 4 hours getting a group together, to go to a dungeon, to not finish it, and to get lost. And they also didn't like going down to a dungeon and just hanging around hoping people would show up to get a group. Weird. So it was time for a change, and they sat down and they got their heads together to try and make their audience feel better, because it turned out not everybody playing games was capable of gaming for 16 plus hours a day, which were the people who made these games. So they had to design them for that wider audience. And you'll see that. The best example you'll see is like Diamol and Scarlet Monastery, which came later. They were then still big giant dungeons, but broken up into nice 20 to 30 minute sections. You could go down and do the whole thing, sure, but you could also just go Diamol East, Diamol West, Scarlet Library, etc, etc, etc. Gone were those twisty, windy corridors and mazes. Now we were pretty linear. And gone were those big precipices where little Joey on a bad day fumbled his controller and fell down into a hole, ruining the whole run. And what we had now was nice simple chunks. By Wrath of the Lich King, most dungeons have been reduced to just 20-minute runs, nice and simple. There were a couple of extras, sure, like Arnket the Old Kingdom. Doing that whole place is a good 40-minute run if you do the optional bosses. And we always do the optional bosses, don't we? Now, I've talked mainly about WoW, but all the games did this. Let's go over to the Weeb camp. By Stormblood in Final Fantasy XIV, they found the formula that worked best for them. And since that point, every single dungeon has been almost identical in flow. Now, their dungeons are all very story-focused. Loot is a very secondary concern, so the gameplay is formulaic to tell a story in the best way. It has a straight pathway, a new biome after each boss, and a pretty set 20-minute completion time for the average group. Literally, every single dungeon since then until now has followed this exact formula. By design, Yoshi P, hallowed be his name, Yoshi P had an interview with Famitsu where he talked about dungeon design specifically. Yoshi P said, in the first place, the dungeons in FF14, with the exception of some early dungeons, are basically a single path. Now, I can get my hands on the dungeons I made in the early days, and no longer do I get lost. The reason for this is that in order to easily play multiplayer without wasting a lot of time, side paths are unnecessary. And even if they were provided, players would only be able to take the optimal route. For the Guild Wars 2 guys, they did exactly the same thing. They entirely removed their dungeon system and replaced it with a new system that suited their player base called Fractals. These were 10 to 20 minute drop in, drop out, fast played content. Now the 20-minute stuff is kind of the really hard stuff. Everything else, 10 minutes, in and out, easy fun. Elder Scrolls Online, exactly the same thing again. They made all their dungeons that sweet 20-minute mark. I don't get it, right? It's like they all got together. They put on their hoods, they sat around the MMO Cabal table, and they all universally decided that for a multiplayer game, 20 minutes is the exact amount of time it should take. I did a little Twitter poll. 20 minutes. Everybody said the same thing. Anything longer than 20 minutes starts to be a hassle for people. It takes too long to set up, too long to do, and they have other things to get on with, so they have to book an evening. Too short, and it becomes like Maw of Souls in Legion, where people just storm through it and they don't care about the dungeon whatsoever. No story, no fun. Oh, but Preacher, World of Warcraft does have non-linear dungeons. Have you never seen the MDI? Lots of different routes and pathways. Yeah, of course I have. Taylor Sanders, the WoW encounter designer, actually brought this up super recently. In that, he describes that they add non-linearity to World of Warcraft dungeons just to keep it a little spicy, but remember, through Mythic Plus and their affixes, they're able to force players to take different routes rather than the optimal route. But realistically, it's just new optimal routes.
For each new season, we like to have a mix of dungeons that are more linear, but also mix that up with dungeons that are more open, like Atal Dazar, you know, and Wakecrest Manor in a way, to try to, you know, keep some variety in there, and players who enjoy routing can have some options, you know, to really like sink their teeth into.
You guys know by now, Mythic Plus changed the way dungeons work. They made them into a pure go, efficient way of doing things. But that also removed all the sense of exploration and adventure, and that has consequences. Let's look at Uldaman, for example, right? In 2004, it had all that sense of wonder and adventure that you would come to know from like an original Zelda title. You would go and defeat the dwarves, connect the 3 pieces of the staff, plant it into a scale model of the city, and then bright shining lights would come through it, glaring onto the door, and then the maiden would come stomping through to try and destroy you. Recently, Uldaman was remade. All that is gone in terms of efficiency. All to give that go prospect the credit it deserves in Mythic Plus, but as a dungeon, it's lost a lot of things. And this has been a ripple effect across many games. So what would you prefer? Would you like that streamlined, linear experience, or would you want that sense of exploration and wonder? I imagine your first impression is, yeah, I want to explore, but not if I have to repeat it every single week. But for sure, I do miss that sense of wonder and excitement, those hold your breath moments that I look forward to every single week where I turn the UI off and watch what's going on. And I absolutely definitely prefer that to planning out a route in an add-on before we even step inside.
I'm afraid this group is full, laddie. Better luck next time. Stupid travelers.
Okay, we're gonna do a dungeon then. But that involves one of the biggest nightmares of all time. Other people. Honestly, finding other people for a dungeon can be really rough. Of course, in World of Warcraft, you're gonna need a full job history, the bank statements for the last 6 years, and proof of identity of your mother's shoes before you're gonna be invited into a group. In other games, it's like LFG and auto matchmaking that makes it work, which most people prefer, but not always. I mentioned earlier that in EverQuest, dungeons were these outdoor, non-instance, sprawling areas, and that Wailing Cavern's first design turned out to not be a dungeon at all, but a waiting area. So get this. Back in the day, the developers really thought what players wanted to do was head down to a dungeon and then just hang around, kill stuff, and then hope and pray that someone would just show up and they would do the same thing. And then eventually, a tank, a healer, 3 DPS would also show up so that you could go off and eventually do your dungeon. And it's why they created all those outdoor areas just full of mobs to kill. And you know what? Some players just didn't like that. This is why, right? All them old school dungeons, your Black Fathom Dapes, your BRDs, your Wailing Caverns, your Ultimans, they all have these like weird outdoor areas that are just full of mobs because they intended you to just go down there and grind until people showed up. You've got to remember something here. Up until very close to World of Warcraft's release, quests weren't designed to give experience. They were just breadcrumbs to take you to somewhere else. It was only recently that they decided that maybe just grinding enemies wasn't the way you should level in MMOs. It's not actually until the World of Warcraft beta opened that they got all this feedback, and the devs were genuinely surprised and shocked that people didn't enjoy this. And in Wrath of the Lich King, they came up with the LFD system, but darkness fell on the world because you suddenly realized that all those players you see running around nearby, well, they might not be as good as you are. This is really tough to solve and has been plaguing several games for years. The fact is, right, players have a wildly different ability level. Random matchmaking is really only useful if the thing you are queuing into is pretty basic. Once the difficulty goes up, just pairing up anyone who is capable of clicking the join queue button just doesn't work anymore. World of Warcraft's Cataclysm saw the effects of this. Wrath dungeons were too easy, so they tried to bring some difficulty back, and it just didn't work. The success rate was so low that people left the game, and Blizzard had to nerf them all. Other games saw this and made their queuable content so easy and matchmaking for harder stuff, but of course, it's back again. Consequences. All the other games, they just kept it simple. They had a distinct gap between the normal and pretty rewarding system that was the queuable content, and then the prestige of the harder matchmaking content with just no in-between. FF14, for example, recently introduced the variant dungeons, after of course all the hordes of Western players yearned for harder dungeon content. Their solution was an extremely easy explorer mode with a great twist. The outcomes of the dungeon had many possibilities depending on what the players did during the run. It created a wonderful puzzle to solve with hidden bosses, etc. for them to find. But then, 2 hard modes that very quickly gave seasoned players a wall to climb in a smaller 4-man environment. Guild Wars 2 added a gearing system called Agony that actively time-gated players from climbing the ranks of fractals until they had clearly tested their mettle in the earlier content. I personally think most players would prefer every single piece of content to be queuable and to suit their personal schedules and lifestyle, but the reality is that in practice, it just doesn't work. I find if you aren't someone who enjoys joining a regular group or a guild, then FF14's system is the best, but ultimately, match-made systems in MMOs are going to be less rewarding than setup groups, and if they weren't, they would kill a huge part of the game for many players as the content would have to be so easy. Dungeons are expected, and they're an exciting part of any adventure, especially in MMOs. So think about what is best, especially with everything we've seen today with all the devs and their opinions and what they created and what they had to change. I took to Twitter to find out what you guys think is perfect. I got a ton of responses, and the answers were almost universal. Players want large, epic, grand dungeons that they can go to, be fully immersed in, and adventure through with a story to tell afterwards. But they don't want to farm them like that. They want non-linear, interesting environments with choices to make and coordination, but no longer than 20 minutes. Players want interesting trash with crowd control, interrupts, solid teamwork and gameplay, while still being able to do enormous AoE damage and blast everything to death. So with all that in mind, what is the best dungeon ever made?
My personal favorite dungeon that I've ever done was Eye of Ashara.
Halls of Reflection. Stratholm.
All right, my favorite dungeon is Halls of Valor.
My favorite dungeon is Shadowfang Keep.
My all-time favorite dungeon is Cathedral of Eternal Night.
I'm gonna go with the Feeder of Pain.
Amarok from Final Fantasy XIV.
Oh, yeah, that's gotta be Waycrest Manor.
100% it's gotta be VC.
My favorite dungeon is Mount Golg.
Hazavesh, Solia's Gambit.
My favorite dungeon is Halls of Reflection.
Hi, I'm Dratnos, and my favorite dungeon is Tazavesh, the Veiled Market.
Stormstout Brewery.
I don't have like a favorite dungeon, but I have like favorites. And I think it's the Vault.
As you guys can see, everybody has a different answer. Everybody wants something slightly different, which of course makes it super difficult for the people behind the scenes to make something that appeases everybody, and the fact is, it can't happen. But having said that, what do I think is the quintessential MMO dungeon? My actual pinnacle of MMO dungeon design? Well, it goes old school. It's the Deadmines in World of Warcraft. The Deadmines for me represents everything good about an adventure in a dungeon that is also repeatable and farmable and gets me excited every single time I get to go there. There is so much story going on through the different environments you go on, to that grand opening into the Archway and seeing that ship down in the cove waiting to be attacked. We have big moments like Mr. Smite running at you with his hammer, sitting in the cannon to blow the doors off, the goblin lurking in his foundry, and then of course to top it all, Van Cleef waiting for us. And then even after that, we get some extras. We see Cookie running around on the bottom for so a little bit of extra loot. And every time I think about it, it's a perfect amount of time. Every single thing is put in with such care and detail and attention. And I struggle to think, despite the amazing dungeons that I've visited over the last few years, there's something that I think about as regularly as the Dead Mines, and when it comes up, everything about it makes me smile. Of course, we have ignored one aspect of dungeons that is pretty important, and that is them shinies. Thank you so much for coming along on this adventure with us. This video was something that has been burning in our minds for ages to look at all the dungeons, especially after a Project MMO, and frankly, we love making them. As you've seen on YouTube, we have changed direction a little bit. Our focus is primarily on these big legacy style videos. It's what we were known for, it's what you guys loved in the past, and it's what we want to do. So if you want to support us a little bit more than hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell, you can head over to our website where you can help support us and get access to behind the scenes footage and all that kind of stuff. So thank you again, guys, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye. Too much?
It's so good. I wasn't expecting it. We did a couple of versions, but I actually that's really funny.
Got it.
That's really funny. It's just like, it's such a thing that's like so stupid.
Yeah, exactly. Just ultimate sadness. You gonna keep moving around while I'm shooting? Are you? You can tell me. You give me the stink eye? You're a good boy.